Hi, it's Pastor Andy, and as I mentioned yesterday, Romans 5:15 is a verse that we can see even perhaps some reasons that for some misinterpretation as it relates to the word many. Verse 20 is another verse that many will misinterpret. So let me give some clarity to that verse. But first, let me read that verse for us. Romans 5:20 says, "Now the law came in to increase the trespass, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more." The question is this: if God gave the law and that made the trespass increase, then does God want sin to increase? And again, if you just look at the logic of what Paul says, he basically says we could turn this around and question it by saying this: if God had not given the law, then would sin have increased? And therefore, if God did not give the law, sin would not increase. Well, is that what Paul is saying? The answer is no. And to take it one step further, Paul is in no way advocating that we sin in order to receive grace, that we sin more in order to receive grace. That is the point that he will make in the first few verses of Romans chapter 6, which we'll cover in 2 weeks. Next week is Hub Sunday, so we're going to move aside for a week from our series in Romans. Certainly, God does not want sin to increase. He could not be a holy God and want people to be further from Him than we already are, if that was possible. So what does Paul mean? Well, let us remember that in Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 14, which was last week's message from November 15th, that we die because of sin. And to trespass is to sin, but we can sin without trespassing. I encourage you to go back and watch the sermon from November 15th and or last Tuesday's video, November 17th, where I talk about this distinction between sin and trespass. But Paul made clear in those earlier verses that people died without the law. What the law does is reveal the areas in our life which are sinful. To trespass is to cross that boundary. We do so intentionally, but we can sin even if we don't know the law, even if we don't have the law. We just won't know that we are sinning. Therefore, once we have the law, if we break the law, then we are trespassing. So as Paul writes in Romans 5:20, when the law is when the law is given, the trespasses increased. Now, in this case, Paul is he is fully equating sin and trespasses here, which I made that distinction last week and just kind of gave a brief overview a moment ago. But in either sense, what Paul is saying is that grace increased all the more. We see this phrase, all the more, several times, or something very similar to it, several times throughout Romans chapter 5. Paul is continually contrasting the idea of sin and death to the grace and the life and the general goodness of God in these particular verses. But in verse 20, Paul uses a term that means super-abounding. It says that the grace abounded all the more. That Greek word, the prefix on that word is huper, which means greatly or super. And so the idea is that it is super abounding. I mentioned in the sermon yesterday, it's the difference between taking a gym ball and bouncing those big rubber balls you play dodgeball with or something like that, and bouncing it and seeing it bounce 8 to 10 feet in the air versus taking a super ball, one of those little rubber super balls, and bouncing it and seeing it going 20, 30 feet in the air and then continuing to bounce afterwards. See, we cannot break free from sin. That is the idea of law being given and sin increasing. When we know the law, we tend to have trouble keeping the law at some time. If there was no speed limit, you could not break the speed limit. But once you see the speed limit, you have to make a choice. And every time on an interstate that you choose to go 70.5 miles an hour, now I know cars don't get to that level, but let's say 71 miles an hour, you are breaking the law. Now, you might disagree with me that it's not a big deal to go 1 mile over the speed limit. But if the limit is 70, you're breaking the law. So if the law wasn't there, you couldn't increase how many times you broke it. But because there is a law given, every time you go to 71 or 72 or 78 or 85, you are breaking the law. That is what Paul means here. And we cannot break free of that apart from the grace of God. But it's not just any amount of grace, because God's grace superabounds. It doesn't matter the level of sin. It doesn't matter how much we sin, the depths of sin, the horrors of our sin. God's grace will cover it. Again, it doesn't give us an excuse to sin. Romans chapter 6. So the law may make sin increase. So why would God give the law if sin increases? Well, I would suggest it's so that we better understand our need for redemption. See, as people sink deeper into sin, they may finally realize the truth of their needs for the grace of God. As sin increases, God's grace will abound all the more. God's grace will superabound. God's purpose is not just to show off His grace, but until we realize our need for grace, then a verse such as Romans 5:8 that says, "But God demonstrated, showed His own love to us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." If we don't understand the significance of our sin, which can only be made known through the law, then we have no need for a but God kind of God. Thus, only by grace can we break free. As Paul writes later towards the end of Romans chapter 8, it is not just about overcoming sin, it is about being conformed to the image of Jesus. So it's breaking free from sin, which also then would require a reduction in sin to become more like Jesus. But it is becoming obedient to the law that we now know through the power of the Spirit, as Paul says in Romans 8, chapter 8, verse 4. So God's purpose is not to increase sin. It is not even to increase grace. His superabounding grace is to make us righteous and to give us life, which are both possible by the greatest gift of grace we have received, the gift of Jesus.